Holding Sacred Space, Survivor-Safe Leadership for Pagan Communities. My name is Krys Copeland, and I serve as the head of the Order of Survivors within the Correllian tradition. Additionally, I volunteer with Correllian Publishing, and I am a writing and communications coach for Speak Your Own Book, a fair trade writing service. And I am a survivor of trauma and abuse. In this session, we'll be talking about how leadership can become both a safe harbor and a force for healing in our pagan communities, and how we as leaders can create survivor-safe structures that prevent harm before it takes root. This is not just theory for me. It's lived experience, shaped by years of working with survivors and building policies that protect both people and the sacred spaces we share. The Pagan World Congress is a rare and powerful gathering, a place where voices from many paths meet to share wisdom, challenge norms, and imagine a stronger, more ethical future together. Even though we may be connecting through a screen today, our shared presence creates its own circle, and that's where I'd like us to begin. Let's take a moment to ground together. If you're able, place your feet flat on the floor. Take a slow breath in, feeling the air fill your lungs, and let it out just as slowly. Feel your body's weight supported by the chair or the floor beneath you. Imagine roots growing down from the soles of your feet into the earth, deep and steady. On your next inhale, draw up strength and stability from the earth into your body. On your exhale, release any tension, distraction, or worry that might pull you away from this moment. Let's take one more breath in together and out. When you're ready, open your eyes or lift your gaze back to the screen, bringing that steadiness with you. Now let's talk about what survivor-safe leadership looks like, why it matters, and how you can bring it to your own community. When we step into leadership within pagan spaces, we're not only caretakers of people, but also of sacred space itself. That means the way we lead carries spiritual weight. I hold 3 intentions at the heart of survivor-safe leadership. The first is care that protects. Care is more than offering comfort. It is warding, shielding, and holding the circle so that those who enter are safe. We know that once a circle is cast, it must be protected. The same is true for our communities. The second is leadership that heals. In our traditions, healing is a sacred act. Leaders have the power to either deepen wounds or create spaces for restoration. Survivor-safe leadership chooses to be a vessel for renewal, embedding compassion into the foundation of community life. The third is structure that prevents harm. Just as we follow ritual steps to ensure balance and integrity, communities need clear frameworks that keep power in check. A good policy is like strong ritual boundaries. It keeps harmful energy from crossing into the circle unnoticed. These 3 intentions, care, healing, and structure, are like the 3 legs of a sturdy cauldron. Without one, the cauldron tips and the contents come tumbling out. Together, the legs hold the work steady. Survivor safety is not only an ethical responsibility, it is a spiritual one. To protect our people is to honor the sacred within them. To prevent harm is to keep our circles whole. And to lead with healing is to serve as a priest, priestess, or priestess, not just in ritual, but in the daily weaving of community. In many pagan communities, the veil between the mundane and the sacred is thin. We gather in woods, circle in living rooms, and honor ancestors and deities through ritual. But behind these acts of communion are people with wounds that haven't healed, stories that haven't been witnessed. Many who walk through your temples, groves, or covens are survivors. Survivors of abuse, betrayal, spiritual harm, and trauma. These sacred spaces hold deep longing for healing, yet often lack the structures to safeguard those who carry wounds. Because our paths are decentralized, because we value the open sky over domed sanctuaries, Few pagan spaces have survivor-safe structures. There's no institutional scaffolding, no standardized training, often not even a naming of what qualifies as harm. And when we lack these guardrails, pain doesn't remain quiet. It echoes. Missteps become ritual misfires. Unresolved trauma finds expression in power plays, and harm that could have been intercepted becomes normalized. Picture a full moon ritual. The coven gathers, candles are lit, and hands are clasped in the casting of the circle. In the script, the high priestess calls for a symbolic binding, asking each participant to let cords or scarves be tied around their wrists as a way of uniting the group. For most, this is a beautiful gesture of solidarity. But for one member who carries a history of abuse involving physical restraint, the act of being bound is not symbolic. It is triggering. She freezes, but the group doesn't notice. The priestess gives no option to step aside or participate in another way. No acknowledgement that someone might find this uncomfortable or unsafe. The ritual continues, and because there are no clear structures for consent in ritual, she feels forced to comply rather than break the circle. Afterwards, she leaves shaken and doesn't return. The leaders, unaware of what happened, assume she simply lost interest. The wound goes unspoken, and the next time the ritual is repeated, another survivor may be harmed in the same way. What I'm naming now, the lack of structure, is not just organizational weakness. It's a wound in our spiritual integrity. Our traditions teach us to cast circles, to tend the fire, to keep the sacred safe. If we fail to tend one another's emotional and spiritual safety, the land we honor will feel hollow. Trust fractures, communities fracture, and harm multiplies in the shadows. So why does this matter? Because the scale of the problem isn't small. Survivors are among us, often unrecognized, because without intentional prevention, without policies, clarity, and compassionate accountability, harm recedes like a silent tide, only to return stronger. For our sacred communities to be whole, the way we lead must be sacred too, not just in spell work, but in care, in structure, in intentional healing. Survivor-safe leadership begins with understanding that healing has no finish line. It unfolds across a lifetime. Pagan leaders know this deeply. Transformation unfolds across cycles, seasons, initiation, and return. We lead from the truth of our own ongoing healing, and in doing so, we become living maps for others. Second, boundaries and awareness are not barriers. They are sacred borders, protecting both self and circle. In much psychological literature, boundaries are described as invisible lines that separate your inner world from the world outside. Physical, emotional, mental, spiritual lines that tell others, this is who I am, and this is how I offer myself. For survivors, these boundaries are not optional. They are shields against re-traumatization, affirmations of our worth, and pathways to reclaiming autonomy and trust. Third, plans matter more than perfection. In survivor-led work, the focus is on consistency, not on flawless ritual. Leadership is reframed as an ongoing practice where mistakes become lessons, and return is the altar on which growth is celebrated. Setting our intentions, writing down how to care, how to intervene, how to listen, this is what we call a plan. Flexibility and humility are part of the circle. Let me reframe that. Healing, boundaries, and plans form a living triad. Healing gives you empathy and depth. Boundaries give clarity and safety. And plans give structure and resilience. It's not about being perfect. It's about leading with awareness, with reverence, and with steady commitment. When self-awareness becomes a survival tool and boundaries keep that awareness intact, leadership becomes a ritual unto itself. Not the kind that ends when candles are snuffed, the kind that holds sacred responsibility, transforms harm into care, and honors every step, even the ones that falter. I want to pause here and give you a mantra for survivor safe leadership, something you can carry with you into ritual, into meetings, into every hard decision you face as a leader. Your trauma explains your behavior. It does not excuse harm. Think of this as a grounding charm, a phrase you can repeat to steady your judgment. It reminds us that compassion and accountability must walk hand in hand. As pagan leaders, we are taught to see the patterns beneath behavior, to trace the root of action to the energy that fuels it. Trauma explains those roots. It gives context. It tells us why someone might act from pain. That awareness is compassion. But explanation is not exemption. If we allow trauma to excuse harm, then the circle itself is put at risk. A leader's role is to understand without enabling, to care without permitting cycles of hurt to repeat. And here is the harder truth. Even survivors can cause harm. Carrying wounds does not give us permission to wound others. Something that my mentor taught me, Amanda Watson, was that hurt people hurt people. If we don't heal ourselves, then we are also at risk of causing harm to others. Survivor-safe leadership means holding each other and ourselves gently, yes, but also firmly, so that harm, once named, is not allowed to deepen. So I offer this mantra once again. Your trauma explains your behavior. It does not excuse harm. Let it be a boundary spell, a reminder that empathy is sacred, but safety is sacred too. Now, I want to bring this knowledge into your own community's context. Let's pause and reflect. How does your community currently handle harm? Do you tend to respond only after something goes wrong, through whispers, silence, exclusion, or magic unspoken? That's reactive. Or have you woven safeguards into the everyday rhythm? Shared agreements, explicit consent rights, clear pathways for healing that welcome accountability before crises arise. That's proactive. Secondly, what would a clear plan look like in your setting? A plan might mean defining what counts as harm in your circle. Ritual violations, breaches of trust, coercion. It might mean creating a named person or role for receiving concerns, or mapping rituals that allow for healing after harm. Or even drafting a shared covenant, storing it in a book of shadows or online space where everyone can see how the community commits to care, consent, and repair. Let me offer a few stories as contrast. Imagine a public belting ritual. The high priest and priestess invite people into a spiral dance. A participant takes the moment as an excuse to grope someone passing by. The energy falters, the harmed person pulls away in visible distress, but the circle keeps moving. Leadership notices, but says nothing in the moment, worried about breaking the ritual flow. Later, the situation is only spoken of in hushed gossip. No one checks in with the harmed person, no one names the behavior to the group, and no clear action follows. The unspoken message is that ritual harmony matters more than survivor safety. That participant is allowed to come back next time, and survivors in the group quietly begin drifting away. Now picture a different Beltane. Before the spiral dance begins, the facilitators state the agreements clearly. Consent is sacred. Hands stay to hands only. If at any point you feel uncomfortable, you may step aside or raise your hand to pause the dance. We will stop if that happens. They've already appointed 2 grounding assistants, visible with colored cords, who are prepared to respond if someone needs help. When a participant tries to cross the boundary, the assistant immediately steps in, interrupts the action, and removes that person from the dance. Afterwards, the leaders gather in the group, reaffirm the boundary aloud, and meet privately with the harmed person to offer choice, care, and agency in deciding what happens next. Trust is preserved because the plan was clear, visible, and enforced. In other words, reactive leadership leaves harm to fester in silence. Proactive leadership sets expectations before ritual, creates visible points of safety, and responds to harm with clarity and compassion in the moment. Take a moment now. In your head, or a journal if you have one, reflect, how does your community handle harm right now? And imagine, what would it look like if you spoke those agreements out loud before ritual, built roles of accountability into the circle, and offered survivors agency in the moment harm happens? Pause now. Just give yourself 30 seconds to 2 minutes of quiet reflection to let those ideas come forward. And when you feel ready, bring that awareness back. Hold that potential plan as a seed. Soon we'll move into healing leadership, how you as a leader can tend that seed and help it grow. As leaders committed to sacred care, our own wellness is the first altar we must tend. Here is the grounded framework for what it means to lead from healing. First, self-awareness and support networks. A healing leader is rooted in self-awareness, tracking emotional resonance, noticing when your triggers arise, and knowing when to step aside. But we do not walk alone. That self-awareness deepens when held in support networks, intimate groups, mentor pairs, or peer coaching circles formed of 4 to 6 fellow leaders. These circles offer confidential space where one person brings a struggle and receives generative questions, deep empathy, and perspective. Not answers, but insight. When I say generative questions, I don't mean AI. I mean the kind of questions that don't try to hand you an answer, but instead invite you to see your situation in a new light. They're open-ended, reflective prompts, like asking, what values feel most at risk here? Or what strengths can you lean on? In pagan leadership, that's how we weave wisdom, not by dictating outcomes, but by helping each other uncover the truth we already carry. Secondly, written boundaries and ethics codes. We honor both spirit and structure. Just as rituals follow drawn circles and invocations, healthy communities need written boundaries, sacred contracts, or ethics codes that name what is supported and what is not. These documents ground consent, comment on abuse of power, and serve as a reference when intention falters. They give clarity, protect trust, and ritualize respect. Thirdly, peer accountability. No one person stands above the circle. As leaders, we share responsibility for care. We open space for peer accountability. We make expectations clear, what counts as harm or ethical breach. We communicate transparently, naming what needs attention. We model accountability by owning our own missteps. We give and invite frequent feedback. And we embrace a culture of learning from mistakes, not blaming them. This isn't top-down policing. It's collaborative weaving of responsibility so that no one leader stands alone in shadow. Why does this matter? Because spirit and structure go together. Healthy leaders create healthy communities. When self-awareness is paired with support circles, boundaries become living safeguards, and peer accountability ensures integrity. Leadership becomes reflexively healing, like a living right. This is the kind of leadership our sacred spaces demand and deserve. In survivor-safe leadership, it's not enough to know what to build. We also have to recognize what to stop. These are the patterns that corrode circles if they are not interrupted. The first is when leaders use their own pain to deflect feedback. Picture this. After a ritual, a participant quietly approaches to suggest that the fire should be smaller next year so that people with mobility issues can circle more easily. Instead of hearing the concern, the high priest answers, "Do you know how much grief I've carried this year? Do you know what it cost me to even hold this ritual? You people are never satisfied." In that moment, the issue of accessibility disappears and the conversation becomes about the leader's personal suffering. The consequence is that no one raises the concerns again. Small harms repeat, and eventually the most vulnerable stop showing up. The second pattern is spiritual exceptionalism. Imagine a priestess leading an initiatory rite. She announces that blindfolds will be used, saying, "This ritual was given directly to me by the goddess. It must be done this way." No options are offered, no space is made for consent. Participants who are uncomfortable feel pressured to comply because questioning her is framed as questioning the goddess herself. That is not sacred authority, that is spiritual coercion. When divine language is used to override consent, safety collapses. And the third is isolation in decision making. Think of a Samhain where the group has prepared for ancestor veneration, but when members arrive, they discover the ritual was rewritten that afternoon. Instead of honoring the ancestors, they're plunged into an intense shadow working with no notice, no preparation, and no opt-out. People feel ambushed, not included. Trust erodes, and eventually participation dwindles because members never know what they're walking into. These patterns, deflecting with pain, claiming spiritual specialness, and isolating decisions, are not signs of strong leadership. They are signs of imbalance of power. Interrupting them means being open to feedback without defensiveness, treating consent as sacred in every rite, and keeping decision-making shared. That is what preserves both trust and safety in our communities. So here's the work for you to carry forward. Consider how these patterns might already show up in your own spaces. Ask yourself what accountability looks like when feedback is offered, how consent is upheld when spiritual authority is invoked, and how your circles are included in decision-making. That reflection is how we begin to interrupt these patterns before they cause deeper harm. In pagan leadership, ethics is how the circle cares for everyone equally. It's not enough to protect students or to protect leaders. We must protect each other because harm is harm, no matter where it comes from. Let me say that again. Harm from a student counts as harm. Harm from a leader counts as harm. The circle must treat both with the same care and integrity. Here's what that looks like in practice. First, protect students. Protecting students means naming limits clearly. Ritual contracts, safe words, pre-ritual notices. We owe them clarity, space, and care from the start. Second, protect leaders too. Leaders are not immune to harm. They can be verbally attacked or emotionally despaced by gossip, accusations, or isolation. So ethical care means having conflict response agreements, peer check-ins, and circles where concerns can be raised safely, not to tear people down, but to support repair and growth. Third, harm is harm, regardless of source. Let me tell you what that means spiritually. When a member harms a leader or another member, or when a leader harms another leader or a member, the wound affects the web that holds the circle together. The Wiccan Rede says, "And it harm none." But we also know that isn't just advice. It is a living boundary that asks us to act. Protecting only students or only leaders is letting bias shape justice. So here's the reflection to sit with. How does your community protect both students and leaders? Do you have ways to address harm originating from anywhere in the circle? Do your processes treat harm equally, regardless of lineage, role, or tenure? Ethics that protect everyone equally, that is how we build sacred safety. In community ethics, we talked about protecting everyone equally. But survivor-centered ethics goes further. They place the needs of those who have been harmed at the very center of our structure. Because if survivors are safe, then the circle itself is safe. The first step is documenting survivor needs. Too often, these needs are left unspoken or remembered only until the next ritual. Writing them down makes them real. For example, if someone tells you that chanting in unison makes them feel trapped, you note that in your ritual planning. The next time you say out loud, "You may speak this silently," or "not at all." That small adjustment signals, "We see you, and your safety is part of our sacred work." The second step is defining manipulation and coercion. In pagan spaces, coercion can hide under spiritual language. A teacher might say, if you trusted your ancestors, you would join this rite. Or confessing your struggles is the only way to prove your depth. That is not spiritual authority. That is spiritual coercion. Survivor-centered ethics means we name that behavior for what it is, and we put it into writing so it cannot be dismissed as a misunderstanding. The third step is banning retaliation for good faith reports. Survivors already risk so much when we speak. If the result is gossip, exclusion, or being labeled difficult, then silence wins and harm repeats. Survivor-centered ethics state clearly, anyone who raises a concern in good faith will be protected, not punished. Reporting becomes an act of care, not an act of self-sacrifice. By making ethics survivor-centered, not student-centered, not leader-centered, but survivor-centered, we are naming the heart of the circle. Because when survivors are safe, leaders are safe. When survivors are safe, students are safe. When survivors are safe, the whole community is safe. So ask yourself, where are survivor needs already showing in your circles? And how can your policies name them, protect them, and treat them as sacred commitments? In survivor-safe leadership, we must also face this truth. Sometimes survivors cause harm. Carrying wounds does not place anyone above accountability. The first principle is compassion with accountability. We honor that pain that shapes behavior, but we also say clearly, harm cannot continue. Both truths must stand together. The second principle is to focus on patterns, not intent. A single sharp word may be a moment of hurt. But if a survivor in leadership regularly dismisses boundaries or belittles others, that pattern matters more than whether they meant well. The third principle is to follow due process, not popularity. Too often, communities let sympathy or alliances decide outcomes. Survivor-led spaces keep credibility by using fair steps. Listen, assess, set boundaries, and create a path for repair. Here's a simple example. In a coven council, a survivor repeatedly interrupts and mocks others. The group doesn't gossip, and they don't excuse it as just their trauma. Instead, two peers meet with this person, name the behavior, and set a clear expectation. It must stop. The council offers support, but also makes it plain that continued harm will carry consequences. That is survivor-safe leadership. We do not abandon compassion. We do not abandon accountability. We hold both, because healing is honored when survivors are cared for, and the circle is honored when survivors are held to the same standards as everyone else. Policies might sound dry to some, but in a pagan context, they are sacred spells. Let me explain how each kind of policy functions like spellcraft. Crafted, powerful, and deeply meaningful. First, a plan before crisis is a protection spell. Imagine writing a policy for handling boundaries in a ritual. That advanced planning is like drawing a ward around your circle, an energetic container that keeps harmful patterns from slipping in. Just as you wouldn't cast your circle without your tools and invocation, you don't wait for a crisis to create your code of care. You write it, bless it, and the community is protected before harm even arrives. Second, responding with clarity becomes a binding spell. When harm happens, a clear response, like naming the behavior, calling a council, offering repair, is like casting a binding. It holds the moment in place with structure, refusing to allow that harm to spread. The circle sustains its shape, trusting the process because the response was ready, precise, and ritualized. Third, supporting impacted people is a healing spell. Written pathways for survivor care, like naming a safe person, offering restorative circles, or allowing space to pause, are acts of ceremony. Those policies channel compassionate energy into tangible actions. They're the equivalent of laying hands on the wounded, but with words, structure, and community backing. Here's a specific image. Before every major ritual, your community reviews its safety compact, a concise written statement of what each person can expect, consent language, pause signals, support roles. That document acts as a talisman, held in everyone's attention. When harm occurs, you don't improvise. Your response is drawn from that compact. It holds the circle steady, like a spell woven beforehand. Crafting policy in this way is no less sacred than writing an incantation. It calls divine attention, shapes the energy of your sacred space, and protects the people within it. So here's what I ask you to reflect on. What current policy in your circle already feels like a protection spell? Where in your community could a written binding bring order after chaos? And how might you script your healing practices so that they become living spells of care for those who need them? When we write policy with intentionality, we are not only protecting our communities, we are casting sacred structures for a safer, more compassionate world. We've talked about the power of sacred policy, how it can protect, bind, and heal our communities. Now let's move towards action. I want to show you why starting with simple, real steps matters, because even small policies can make a large difference. First, immediate starter steps carry real impact. You don't need to wait for a perfect, fully owned code. Begin with something tangible, a brief consent script at the top of every ritual, a simple statement of, you have the right to step aside. That first step lays the groundwork for safety to grow. In pagan language, it's like planting the first sigil in the soil. Small, but it anchors the energy. Second, frame these as first steps, not final steps, accessible for every stage. Whether your circle is new to policy work or focused on refining advanced protocols, starter policies let anyone begin. Leaders, elders, coven starters. It's the difference between I don't know where to begin and I can add this 3-line ritual boundary tonight. Inclusive policy invites participation instead of paralysis. Third, doable policies build trust and safety. When people see consistent small efforts like an announcement of consent or naming a safe person, they feel held. That builds trust. Trust leads to engagement. Engagement sustains the work. In public governance, that's one of the top benefits of early clarity. So here's how these starter policies serve your circle. They are practical tools, not theory. They are doable, not overwhelming. They open possibility, not shut it down. A single clear step can ignite change across cycles. That's why we begin, because this work needs us urgently and lovingly. Now that we've learned why simple policies matter, let's go deeper, beginning with the ethics policy, the compass that guides everything else. An ethics policy isn't just a code. It's a circle's way of honoring what we vow to protect. It names what's sacred and what crosses the line before that line is crossed. Imagine how simply naming realities can transform practice. If someone shares they're triggered by loud voices or being called out in ritual, the ethics policy says, this circle names reactivity as a known dynamic. To protect safety, leaders will offer advanced announcement and explicit invitation before collective calling. That notice is consent in action. It turns an unspoken pain into a held boundary. If survivors need ritual sign language adaptations or altars placed at standing height, these accommodations belong in ethics. Those practical notes become spiritual commitments. They say, we recognize trauma can come in many forms, and we choose care over comfort. That matters more than the exact words. And finally, we write into the ethics the concept of block trauma as shield. Not as exclusion, but as protection. When someone declines a practice because of trauma, the circle responds as ritual support, not disruption. It's written assurance that choice is respected, and that's powerful. I recommend seeing how the Tollis Tree of Life Interfaith Sanctuary crafts this care into their membership ethics. They start with generosity of spirit and mutual trust. They name truth-telling, self-directed learning, and safeguard safe space. And they give process for discord, including council and board decision-making. You don't need to replicate it word by word, but notice how these ethics become narrative, commitment, and care all in one policy. Reflect for a moment. What survivor realities could your ethics policy name today? What accommodations could become sacred commitments to write down? And how could your ethics language offer space for withdrawal or adaptation as a form of spiritual support, not judgment? What we write becomes ritual. Ethics done well is not bureaucracy. It is the spell that holds the circle safe. When harm is reported in a pagan community, what happens next cannot be left to chance. A reporting flowchart makes the process visible and reliable. It ensures survivors know what will happen, leaders know their role, and the wider circle can trust that concerns will not vanish into silence. There are 3 key elements to building this kind of flowchart. First, name multiple safety receivers. Every community needs more than one point of contact for reports of harm. If the only receiver is away, burned out, or connected to the person accused, the process collapses. Choose at least 2 or 3 people that members can approach, elders, peer leaders, or trusted clergy, and publish those names clearly. Make sure they represent diversity in gender, age, or role so that people feel they can choose someone they trust. Second, offer anonymous paths. Survivors may not be ready to reveal themselves, especially in small covens or groves where relationships are tight and fear of backlash is real. Anonymous reporting can be as simple as a confidential online form, a sealed envelope collected at ritual, or an email address managed by more than one leader. What matters is that the community knows you can be heard without putting yourself at risk. Third, set timelines for response. One of the deepest wounds survivors name is silence. When they speak up and nothing happens, the harm doubles. A good flowchart commits to a response within a set time frame, such as an acknowledgement within 48 hours and a council review within 7 days. Even if the full resolution takes longer, survivors should always know when they will hear back. Here's what this looks like in practice. After a teaching circle, a participant reports that they were pressured to share something deeply personal even after they declined. That pressure left them unsettled. Because the community has a reporting flowchart, they know who they can approach. They bring the concern to one of the safe receivers, who listens and thanks them for speaking. Within 2 days, the receiver follows up, explains the next steps, and assures the survivor their concern will be carried forward. Within a week, a small council meets. They check with the survivor about what support they need. Then they meet with the teacher, not to condemn, but to counsel, explaining clearly why the behavior was harmful and how it impacted trust in the circle. Hopefully, when this is named with compassion and clarity, the teacher realizes the mistake, offers an apology, and seeks guidance or retraining on consent and facilitation. If that willingness is absent, the council may pause their teaching role until growth and accountability are demonstrated. The survivor receives updates throughout, so they know the concern is being acted on. The flowchart provides the steady path: report, response, review, and resolution. That way, survivors feel held, teachers receive guidance instead of public shaming, and the circle sees harms addressed with fairness and care. The benefit of this structure is twofold. It protects survivors by giving them safe choices, and it protects leaders by ensuring fairness and consistency. No one is left wondering, what do I do now? The path is already laid out. If you want to see a working example of a reporting flowchart, the Order of Survivors has published a reporting flowchart on our Facebook group. It's one model of how a simple, visible process can make survivor safety part of the culture, not just a promise. Now we come to the restorative action plan, the ritual practice that restores what is broken. In pagan communities, healing isn't an afterthought. We return to the circle with structured care, repairing harm step by step. Restorative justice is built around repairing relationships, not punishing individuals. It offers those harmed a central place, invites the person who caused harm to take responsibility, and allows the community to rebuild trust together. Here's how a restorative action plan serves that vision. First, summary of harm. Document what happened, not as an accusation, but to clarify the wound. One example could be, during the teaching circle, the participant was asked to share a trauma story after expressing discomfort, and that caused impact. Secondly, temporary boundaries. Before full repair, safety comes first. That might look like giving both parties space, like pausing joint facilitation for the teacher and offering the survivor a healing space with a grounding assistant. Thirdly, re-entry checkpoints. Healing is a journey, not an instant fix. Set soft checkpoints, such as a follow-up circle in 2 weeks where the survivor can speak, possibly supported by someone they trust, and the person who caused harm can reflect on their steps towards accountability. Here's how it can work in practice. A participant reports that during several teaching circles, they felt silenced when a teacher kept interrupting and speaking over them. For the survivor, this pattern became harmful, leaving them feeling disregarded and unsafe. A restorative meeting is called with the survivor, the teacher, and 2 facilitators. The circle begins with grounding and a simple blessing to frame the work as sacred. Each person speaks without interruption. The survivor shares how repeated interruptions make them feel invisible. The facilitators affirm the harm and invite the teacher to reflect. At first, the teacher seems surprised. They hadn't realized how often they cut people off. As the conversation deepens, the teacher shares that they live with ADHD and that impulsive speech is a struggle. They acknowledge this doesn't excuse the impact, but it helps explain why it happened. Together, the group looks for solutions. The teacher volunteers an apology, and they agree to new practices, such as using a talking stick in group settings, or having a peer gently signal if they begin interrupting, or taking a 1-month pause from leading discussions to focus on listening. At a follow-up circle, the facilitators ask, has the teacher honored these commitments? Has the survivor felt a shift in safety and respect? If yes, the teacher resumes their role with ongoing support. If not, the pause continues until trust is restored. This process protects the survivor, gives the teacher tools to grow, and shows the whole community that harm can be addressed with both compassion and accountability. So why does this matter? Restorative practices center healing over hierarchy. They give everyone, survivor, accused, and community, a chance to acknowledge harm, honor pain, and weave a path back to wholeness. Restorative justice is not abstract. Pagan communities are already practicing it. Vermont Witch Camp, in the reclaiming tradition, uses restorative circles to address conflict and harm. They invite both the harmed and the person who caused harm into a facilitated circle, where each voice is heard, needs are named, and commitments are made. It's consent-based, trauma-informed, and designed to transform conflict into deeper trust. So reflect now. How might your community name harm without assigning blame? What temporary boundaries honor safety while inviting reintegration? And how could follow-up circles and simple reentry checkpoints support real healing rather than just closing the case? A restorative action plan is the living ritual container that welcomes healing back into the circle. In survivor-safe leadership, we need to be clear about thresholds. Some harm can be handled with restorative work inside the circle. But when harm becomes abuse, the response must be immediate and decisive. Abuse includes coercion, stalking, sexual assault, harassment, and any criminal act, especially when it involves minors, vulnerable adults, or animals. The focus here is not intent, but pattern and impact. If behavior repeats, or if it creates fear and loss of safety, that crosses the line into abuse. When that threshold is reached, the first step is safety. Remove the accused from contact with the survivor and from ritual space. Make sure that the survivor has support and a safe person by their side. The second step is documentation. Write down exactly what happened: dates, times, words, or actions. Save messages or screenshots if they exist. Keep the record clear and factual. The third step is external reporting. If the abuse involves sexual assault, stalking, threats, or any other crime, leadership has a duty to connect with outside services, law enforcement, victim advocates, or safeguarding authorities, depending on the case. This is not about betraying the community. It is about honoring survivor safety and keeping the circle from shouldering what it cannot hold alone. Let me give you an example. Imagine a student reports that their teacher has been pressuring them for private initiation sessions, sending repeated late-night messages, and turning up uninvited at their residence or workplace. That's not just poor boundaries or a need for retraining. That's coercion and stalking. In that case, you separate the teacher from all contact with students. Ensure the survivor is supported, document the behavior, and report to the proper authorities. Only after those safety steps are in place does the council move forward with internal review. The principle is simple. When harm becomes abuse, we act first to protect the survivors, then to document, then to report. Abuse requires removal and outside accountability. Anything less puts both the survivor and the community at risk. And this is even more true today. When we are at threat from a Christian nationalist government, any perceived cover-up of abuse or scandal or crime can reflect poorly on the whole community. We must protect each other, and we must protect our community in the face of Christian nationalism. On this slide, you see the 3 stages of our reporting flow: receive, review, respond. Let me walk you through what that actually looks like in practice. First, receive. This is when someone comes forward. A safe receiver listens, thanks them for speaking, and writes down exactly what they say. No gossip, no interpretation, just the facts. The person reporting is told when they'll hear back, usually within 2 days, so they know their voice won't disappear. Second, review. Within the week, a small council meets. They look at what was reported and compare it directly to the community's written policies. That's the anchor. Did the action match what we've defined as coercion, harassment, or abuse? If so, that triggers the appropriate process. The council also sets immediate safety boundaries, maybe pausing a person's teaching role or creating space between individuals until things are resolved. Third, respond. This is where the council communicates back. The survivor is updated about what's been done, what boundaries are in place, and when the next check-in will happen. If the case meets the threshold for abuse, external reporting is part of this stage. If it's something that could be addressed with restorative action, that path is only taken with the survivor's consent and involvement. They are asked directly if they want restorative steps, and if they do, they help shape what that process looks like. Nothing is imposed upon them. Here's a concrete example so you can picture how this works in practice. A student comes forward and reports that their teacher pressured them into taking part in a private ritual after the student had already said no. That report is received by one of the designated receivers, written down in detail, and immediately acknowledged so that the survivor knows their voice has been heard. The council then reviews the report against the community's written policies. In those policies, repeated pressure after refusal is clearly defined as coercion. And in this community, coercion is named as abuse. With that clarity, the council acts. They suspend the teacher's role and remove their access to students while the matter is under review. Whether this situation also rises to a criminal or legal issue depends on the specifics of the ritual. If it involves sexual contact, stalking, or other actions defined under the law, the council prepares an external report to the appropriate authorities. In these cases, restorative justice is not appropriate for the spiritual group to conduct. Criminal-level harm requires trained professionals and legal systems. Spiritual leaders are not equipped or authorized to mediate at that level. The role of the spiritual community is to cooperate with external reporting, protect its members, and provide survivor support. If the case does not cross into criminal territory, the council may, with the survivor's full consent, consider restorative justice as one possible path. That process might involve the teacher acknowledging the harm, agreeing to specific changes or training, and accepting accountability measures such as temporary limits on their role. If the survivor does not want restorative contact, or if the teacher refuses accountability, then that process remains protective rather than restorative. Throughout the process, transparency is key. The survivor is informed about every step taken, offered advocacy and support, and given clear timelines for follow-up. This ensures that safety comes first and that any consideration of restoration is survivor-driven and appropriate to the level of harm. That's receive, review, and respond in action. 3 steps, always the same, always grounded in policy, so survivors are protected and leaders know exactly what to do. As we come towards the close of this teaching, I want to invite you into a moment of commitment. We've walked through policies and practices, but as we've covered, policy writing is spell work. It only has power when it moves from intention into action. So take a breath and ask yourself, which policy will you begin weaving first? Will it be a statement of community ethics, a reporting flowchart, or a restorative action plan? Choose one thread to pick up now. Next, ask, who in your circle will you share it with this week? Because in pagan leadership, accountability is not about hierarchy. It's about oath and bond within the circle. When you show your draft to another trusted leader, a student, or your council, you're placing your work in the circle, where others can witness and strengthen it. I invite you to write it down like you would set an intention. I will begin writing this policy on day, and I will share it with person or group on day. Then write it in your agenda. Block off that sacred time as you would any ritual or coven meeting. Think of it as making a small ritual promise, not to perfection, but to progress. In this way, your words become action, your action becomes structure, and your structure becomes protection. Accountability begins the moment you speak your intention and let it live in community. That is how we move from learning into transformation. As we close this session, I want to thank you for being present in this circle of learning and reflection. Survivor-safe leadership is not something we master in 1 hour. It is an ongoing practice, and none of us is meant to do this work alone. If you'd like to continue the conversation, here's how we can stay connected. You can reach me directly at christycopeland@gmail.com or find me on Facebook and Instagram at Krys Copeland. I also invite you to join the Order of Survivors, our online space for leaders, survivors, and allies who are committed to building safe, healing-centered pagan communities. You'll find that group at facebook.com/groups/Karelian Order of Survivors. It's a place to share resources, ask questions, and connect with others walking the same path. Remember, the work of creating survivor-safe spaces continues long after this Congress. Every policy drafted, every conversation started, every circle made safer, that's the real legacy. I look forward to walking that path with you. Blessed be.